answered. "I wrote it out of my head." "Well then, young man," was the examiner's comment, "your head is no common one, and if I am not mistaken, we shall hear from you again." During Troward's career in India, his official work kept him very busy. His recreation was often spent with canvas, paints, and brushes. He was an artist of no mean ability, especially in marine subjects, and had won several prizes at art exhibits in England. He loved to study the tomes of sacred Indian lore, or the scripture of the Hebrews and other ancient people. While studying these profound subjects, there was unfolded to him, as in a vision, a system of philosophy which carried with it not only peace of mind, but also physical results in health and happiness. When relieved of his burdensome official duties in the Indian court, he returned to England, where a manuscript of some 100 folios slowly came into existence. At that time he had no knowledge of mental science, Christian Science, New Thought, or any of the other isms of modern thought. His views were the result of solitary meditations and deep study of the Scripture. The first edition of the now famous Edinburgh Lectures was published in 1904. It was received with the almost unanimous opinion that its value could not be overestimated, as was true of his subsequent volumes, Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning, proved especially attractive to churchmen. His books, by sheer worth, have found their way almost all over the world. In the United States alone, more than 50,000 copies have been sold. Perhaps no one was more astonished at their warm reception than their simple-hearted, fun-loving author. An intimate description. In physique, Judge Troward was not the usual English type, but was more like a Frenchman, of medium stature, and not over 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall. He was dark-complexioned, with small, bright eyes, a large nose, and a broad forehead. When I knew him, he had a drooping mustache sprinkled with gray. He had the bearing of a student and a thinker, as is indicated in his writings. His manner was simple and natural, and he exemplified a spirit of moderation in all things. I never saw him impatient or heard him express an unkind word, and with his family he was always gentle and considerate. He seemed to depend entirely upon Mrs. Troward for the household management. Only in the intimacy of his home did he entirely reveal his charming geniality and radiating friendship. His after-dinner manner was one of quiet levity and a twinkling humor. He would enter into the conversation or parlor games of the family with the spirit of a boy. He did not care for public amusement. One evening, after an excellent dinner of soup, joint of lamb, vegetables, salad, dessert, and wine, he rolled a cigarette, and to my great surprise offered it to me with the query, "Do you smoke?" Receiving a negative reply, he began to smoke it himself. Noticing my poorly concealed expression of surprise, he remarked, "Why should you be shocked at anything which you can thank God for?" "I can thank God for one cigarette after, possibly a second, but never a third." After he had finished his smoke, his youngest daughter, Budea, played the violin for us. I observed he became completely absorbed in the beautiful harmony. He told me afterward that although he was intensely fond of listening to music, he was in no sense a musician. Although Troward did not indulge in outdoor sports, he loved nature, and would sit for hours by the sea with his sketch-pack, or tramp the lonely moors in solitary meditation. He said there were times when he obtained his best inspirations while walking in the open. He often invited me to go with him, although frequently he seemed to be unconscious of my presence, being entirely absorbed in his own thoughts. Truth from the trance. At times he would lapse into a trance-like swoon, his Maltese cat on the table by his side, the swoon sometimes lasting for hours. At such times the members of his family would take particular care not to disturb him. When he emerged from these lapses of the senses, he would write down the truth which had been revealed to him. Once he wrote on his memorandum pad, "I am is the word of power. If you think your thought is powerful, your thought is powerful." It may be interesting to recall that such authorities as Barnett and the New American Encyclopedia, in their biography of Socrates, mention similar trance-like experiences of his. While serving in the Greek army, Socrates suddenly found his feet seemingly rooted to the earth, where he remained in a trance for 24 hours. He awakened with a spiritual knowledge that transformed his life, and later the lives of many others. The similarity of the life of this Athenian philosopher to that of Troward is that both relied chiefly upon intuition and common sense for their theory and system of living. A difference between Troward's teaching and that of Christian Science is that it does not deny the existence of a material world. On the contrary, he teaches that all physical existence is a concrete corresponding manifestation of the thought which gave it birth. One is the complement of the other. I once asked him how one could impart to others the deep truth which he taught. By being them, he answered. My motto is, being and not possessing is the great joy of living. Following a trusted guide. Judge Troward, although modest and retiring in his habits of speech and slow to express a personal opinion, was always willing to discuss any current subject, but extremely reticent and diffident about his own writing. Never to my knowledge did he mention them unless approached on the subject. As a teacher, he was positive, direct, and always impersonal. When our lesson was given indoors, he always sat in a large Morris chair, and seeming not to be aware of my presence, he would think aloud. To follow his thought was like following a trusted guide through the most difficult places, the darkest and least explored regions of thought. As I followed, the personality of the man became obscure, and I was only conscious of the clear, commanding voice, and the light of the inward torch which he bore. It was beyond doubt quite natural that he who made so clear the true meaning of individuality should in his teaching betray little of the personal or emotional element. After I had been carefully guided to the most comforting conclusions, in the same quiet, unassuming manner as in the beginning of our mental journey, my guide would gently remind me that he had given me a few suggestions which I might follow if I felt inclined, but which were offered only in the friendly spirit of a fellow traveler. He always tried to impress upon me that every effort to accomplish mental control, which in turn meant control of circumstances, should be undertaken with absolute confidence of success. The length of a lesson depended upon my ability to absorb what he was telling me. If he were convinced, if 15 or 30 minutes, that I understood quite naturally the reason why, for example, if a thing is true, there is a way in which it is true, that lesson was concluded. If it took me an hour or more to get into the spirit of his thought, the lesson was prolonged. At the end of the lesson, he would quietly remark, "Never forget that seeking has finding as its correlative, knocking, opening." With this reassuring statement, he would light his lantern and step into the denseness of the night to walk 3 miles to his home. A home-loving philosopher. Being a home-loving man, Troward delighted in his flower garden, and in the intimacy of his home, which he had provided with every comfort. He particularly enjoyed the seclusion of his studio and study, which were arranged to meet his personal needs and moods. His studio was in the most remote part of the house, and here he would spend hours of relaxation with canvas and paints. His study, however, was on the ground floor, and to it he would retire for meditation and research, usually in the early hours of the morning. He rarely worked at night. He had spent the greater part of the day he died sketching out of doors. When he did not join his family at the dinner hour, Mrs. Troward went in search of him. She found him in his studio, fully dressed, lying on the sofa in a state of physical collapse. About an hour later he passed away. The doctor said that death was caused by hemorrhage of the brain. I am sure that Troward would have said, "I am simply passing from the limited to the unlimited." He died on May 16, 1916, in his 69th year. On the same day the Archdeacon Wilberforce was laid at rest in Westminster Abbey. It was no ordinary link that bound these two men, as you will note in the reproduction of the letter which follows, Troward's last letter to me. Thomas Troward regarded death very much as you would regard traveling from one country to another. He remarked to me several times that he was interested in the life beyond and was ready to go. His only concern seemed to be the sorrow that it would cause his family and wife. When the time came, his going was exactly what he would have wished it to be. I hope that these few intimate touches will give to Troward's friends and admirers the information they desire concerning him. I will add a more personal touch for you by presenting herein one of his first letters to me, with facsimile of his handwriting. Genevieve Baron. Letter. Dear Mr. Swink, I think I had better write you a few lines with regard to your proposed studies with me, as I should be sorry for you to be under any misapprehension, and so to suffer any disappointment. I have studied the subject now for several years, and I have a general acquaintance with the leading features of most of the systems which unfortunately occupy attention in many circles at the present time, such as Theosophy, the Tarot, the Kabbalah, and the like, and I have no hesitation in saying that to the best of my judgment all sorts and descriptions of so-called occult study are in the direct opposition to the real life-giving truth, and therefore you must not expect any teaching on such lines as these. We hear a great deal in these days about initiation, but believe me, the more you try to become a so-called initiate, the further you will put yourself from the living life. I speak after many years of careful study and consideration when I say that the Bible and its revelation of Christ is the one thing really worth studying, and that is a subject large enough in all conscience, embracing as it does our outward life of everyday concern, and also the inner springs of our life, and all that we can in general terms conceive of the life in unseen after putting off the body at death. You have expressed a great degree of confidence in my teaching, and if your confidence is such that you wish, as you say, to put yourself entirely under my guidance, I can only accept it as a very serious responsibility, and should have to ask you to exhibit the confidence by refusing to look into such so-called mysteries as I would forbid you to look into. I am speaking from experience, but the results will be that much of my teaching will appear to be very simple, perhaps to some extent dogmatic, and you will say you have heard much of it before. Faith in God, prayer and worship, approach to the Father through Christ, all this in a certain sense familiar to you. And all I can hope to do is perhaps throw a little more light on these subjects, so that they become to you not merely traditional words, but present living facts. I have been thus explicit, and I do not want you to have any disappointment, and also I should say that our so-called studies will only be friendly conversations at such times as we can fit them in, either you coming to our house, or I to yours, as may be the most convenient at the time. Also I will lend you some books which will be helpful, but they are very few and in no sense occult. Now if all this falls with your ideas, we shall, I am sure, be very glad to see you at Rouen Minor. And you will find that the residents there, though few, are very friendly and the neighborhood is pretty. But on the other hand, if you feel that you want some other sort of learning, do not mind saying so, only you will never find any substitute for Christ. I trust you will not mind my writing to you like this, but I don't want you to come all the way down to Cornwall and then be disappointed. With kind regards, yours sincerely, Thomas Troward. Lesson 1. Interpreting the Word. Feeling that any explanation of some of the words employed in an unusual way in these lessons may be helpful to the student, I herein offer a list of such words, together with my interpretation and reference from Troward. Absolute. That which is free from limit, restriction, or qualification. Webster. An idea from which the element of time and space are entirely absent. Troward. Example, thinking in the absolute would be simply dwelling upon the intrinsic qualities of love, without reference to whom you love, or the various forms through which love expresses itself.